2.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is Mayor Pro Tem Michael Holmes. Welcome to everyone who joined us in chambers today and who is listening online for this month's meeting of our Tech Committee, Transparency, Engagement, and Communication. I am joined at the dais today by Councilmember Amanda Cook, Councilmember Dr. Patrick Harmon, and Councilmember Britt Moore, as well as City Management and staff. We have a few items on our agenda today. We'll begin with item 2024-110, presentation regarding the racial equity scorecard. YWCA of High Point will provide an update on the racial equity scorecard. Assistant City Manager Eric Almedo will introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members. The YWCA of High Point has worked with Dr. Stephen Sills from the National Institute of Minority Economic Development to create this racial equity scorecard. So Dr. Sills is here to present that report. And so with no further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Stephen Sills.
Thank you. And just to clarify, I'm no longer at the National Institute. I'm with the Forsyth County United Way as a professional job and a consultant on the side, but still highly committed to working with High Point on this issue. The Racial Equity Scorecard, and if we can project that up there to the top, great, was a 7-month-long project with the YWCA, working with community members, working with leaders in High Point to develop a measure, a baseline series of measures that we can use to see just how much we're moving the needle over time. Where are we starting in terms of racial inequities in the community, and how do we then measure progress over time? And I have hit the wrong button. There we go. So scorecards are kind of like the instruments on your dashboard. They tell you how fast you're going, how slow you're going, whether you've got gas in your car, if you still drive a car that has gasoline. It lets you know where you're at, and if you also have a GPS, where you might be going. So it works in combination with other tools in our community to let us know just how well we're doing in terms of equity issues. It's a snapshot of the key indicators. It does not go into depth or detail. It doesn't explain why, but it does show some linkages between race and outcomes, as you'll see in some of the measures. In particular, this scorecard is focused on black-white disparities within the city of High Point. This work is intricately linked to the work of the Reparations Commission here in High Point. High Point, one of few cities in the country who've really taken on this very important work to look at how our past has set us up for the inequalities we see in the community today. How do we go back and redress those wrongs? How do we also look at policies that are current and yet still replicating those racial inequalities that have been rooted in our 120-year history? So again, the approach was community engaged. We started with a commission. This wasn't a university coming in. I'm a former professor from UNCG. It wasn't a contracted group saying, here are your measures. It started with engaging the community saying, what do you want to measure? And here are some of the possibilities for us. It was iterative. It looked at the past, looking at a meta-analysis of all research and reports that had come previously, and it worked to identify the best measures for this community from existing data. It didn't collect new data, it used secondary data. And it's very important to point that out. Secondary data is collected by the Census Bureau, it's collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other organizations, and that's important because it continues to be collected. So you can measure over time the changes that are occurring within the community. This community-engaged approach used what we call a user design approach. We brought the instruments, we brought the iterations of the scorecard to the community to say, how does this look? Is it readable? Do we want to change this? Do we want to adapt it? Are the colors appropriate? It was a back and forth process centered on community and how they might use this tool. In the end, we developed a forward-facing or public-facing scorecard. It is up on the YWCA's website. It's been released through the newspaper. It's been presented once at New Hope back in December, and again here. It should be something that should be accessible to all at any point in time, and it should be updated over time. So it should be maintained or updated annually. Just for reference, here are some of the committee members. You'll see that there are resident leaders, there are government leaders, there are industry leaders. There are people from across all sectors of the society who were part of the committee developing this instrument. The task force considered data. What are the best indicators of health, of housing, of the spatial inequalities we see in the community, economic inequalities, educational inequalities, and where do we tease out equity issues in particular? Do we have equal opportunities for safe and affordable housing, for food, for transportation, for birth and early education, for economic development over the life course? We looked at different ways to visualize data. I can put up a whole bunch of statistics and numbers, and most likely everybody's in the audience will, fall asleep or their heads will roll back. So we looked at ways that we could interpret and understand the information in an easily readable manner, a visualized manner. This speaks to a much broader audience. We used maps, bar charts, graphs, and other forms of data visualization so that it's very intuitive to understand each of the data points. We also considered other items like how the community or organizations might be served by the scorecard itself. So the task force gave feedback on indicators, they provided feedback on the visualizations, they recommended next steps, they reviewed the data sources themselves, they prepared ways in which this information could be disseminated, and importantly, they helped develop the recommendations that are at the end of the document. So as I said, we started with what had already been done. Here are just a few examples of scorecards or barometers or measures or maps that have been developed in the past 10 years for Guilford County and High Point specifically. So we drew upon Resilience High Point back in 2019, the Foundation for a Healthy High Point and their key indicators of health, the Quality of Life Explorer that we developed at UNCG, mapping many of the census data points for the community. We looked at national data, state data, local data, and drew upon all of these sources for our materials. There were 65 indicators that were compiled for economics, health, education, housing, and civic engagement. And each of these data points were reviewed. 65 indicators is a lot, and it's probably more than anybody wants to really look at. That's those dense reports that I sometimes produce, and they sit on a shelf. So we didn't want this to sit on a shelf. We wanted it to be something that everybody could understand easily. So we narrowed those indicators down, which were the best at showing racial disparities within this community. So again, through an iterative process, the committee reviewed each of the data points, deciding how well does it display, how well does it speak to the things we want to change in the community, how well does it look at race as a factor in inequities. So some of the design considerations for the presentation: is it clear? Is it simple? Is it organized well? Is the text explanatory and easy to understand? Does it engage the audience? We considered who the audience is, who's going to use this infographic, who's going to read this material and utilize it for policy decisions or for measuring change over time. Here are some of the results. And again, this document is available online. I believe there are print copies available here as well. It's easy to understand each of the data points in the way that they're presented here. I'm not going to go through all of the data points, but I will highlight just a few. For example, 37% of Black households own a home in High Point versus 67% of white households. This is a very important metric. It's easy to read, it's easy to understand. There's a huge difference in home ownership. We've all heard of redlining, we've heard of racial covenants, we've heard of this 120-year-long history that stripped home ownership from Black communities. Urban renewal destroyed where people were living, owning homes, having businesses, having churches, having schools. Our history has taken away and not given back. That 30 percentage point difference stands today as an example of one of the highest levels of disparities, and it leads to many of the other economic disparities that we see as households are not passed from one generation to another, passing that generational wealth on to the next generation. 55% of Black renters are cost burdened versus 42% of white renters. I'll say all renters right now are cost burdened. They're spending more than 30% of their income on housing and housing-related expenses. Our rental markets have gone up dramatically in the last 3 years as a result of the pandemic and limited supply. But Black renters are more impacted than white renters, a 13 percentage point difference there. 57% of Black mortgage applicants were approved for a loan versus 67% of white applicants. When I talk to people in banking, they explain to me that, well, banking is colorblind, but the results are not colorblind. There's a disproportionate impact on those who are seeking a loan if they're Black. And this is controlling for all other factors, controlling for the price of the home, the income of the applicant, the credit history, etc. We see that Black applicants for mortgages are less likely to get the capital they need to buy the same home as an equally qualified white borrower. Poverty rate is another clear example of how 120 years worth of policies have resulted in a huge disparity. 24% of Black households in High Point are under the federal poverty line, while 13% of white households are under that same line. This is very important for lifetime success of youth and for care of aging populations. Educational attainment is a key factor. If you look at the orange representing the Black population, you see that less than high school diploma is twice the proportion as white population. So double the number of individuals in High Point have less than a high school education are Black than white. On the other end of the spectrum, you see the inverse of that. Twice as many white individuals, adults, have attained a bachelor's degree or higher than the Black population. Again, this disparity is rooted in unequal opportunities and school systems that disenfranchise youth. Public safety is a key issue in all of our communities. 54% of arrests in High Point were for low-level nonviolent offenses. 55% of arrestees were Black versus 43% who were white. We see a disproportionate application of justice within the community, over-policing, higher surveillance of Black communities. 45% of police used more force per arrest than 45% of all departments in North Carolina. This is coming to us from a website that aggregates data on police forces across the country, so it gives us a good comparison of how is our local force doing compared to others within the state. Interestingly, this data source notes that 90% of High Point police officers are white, not representing the communities that they are serving. The community worries about crime. We've done a series of surveys of community members. In this case, we saw that 72% of High Point residents worry about violence and crime, but we note that yellow line is showing that property crimes have come down over the last 10 years. Violent crimes have stayed relatively flat. There have been some ups and downs from one year to the next, but relatively flat. The perception is that crime is a huge issue, but the data doesn't always say that. What we're seeing is over-focus on particular communities. Here's an example of mapping that lets us see very clearly the differences between the communities. Green is a higher life expectancy, red and orange and yellow are lower life expectancy. We see a huge gap in life expectancy from one census tract to another within the city. You can go just across the street in some neighborhoods, and you've changed from a low level of life expectancy to a much higher level of life expectancy simply because the economic differences, the availability of food, the availability of primary care facilities, and all of the different elements of social determinants of health that result in a life that's longer in some areas than others. Another serious point to point out regarding health is Black infant mortality. Infant mortality is a great measure when we're talking internationally about development, and we usually use it as a reference to talk about developing versus developed countries. Well, here in North Carolina, here in High Point, we see a huge disparity that's similar to that between developed and developing worlds. 13.4 Black infants out of 1,000 live births die, versus 4.5 who are white. That is a huge difference. And what it comes down to is access to prenatal care and access to neonatal care. A serious issue that needs to be addressed. In one of our projects, we asked individuals within the community about their perceptions of discrimination, how they're treated, if they feel that they're being insulted, called names, if people act as if they're afraid of them, if they feel that people think they're dishonest or receive poor service. As an example, I go into a restaurant and I receive poor service, I'm going to leave a bad tip, it's a bad waiter or waitress. If a person of color goes into that same restaurant and receives bad service, they have to ask themselves, is it because they're a bad waiter or is it because I'm a person of color? I don't have to do that as a white male in this society. 17.9% of our respondents said that they received poor service on a weekly or more often basis. They receive, 21% said that that people act as if they're not smart. 21% said that people acted better than them. And I don't have the percentage on there, a little over 20% said that they were treated with less courtesy. How we treat each other and the perception of that treatment is a key element of how our civic community comes together to address these issues. Lastly, a couple more highlights. Food access. We know that food is very linked to our health outcomes. It is also linked to place. If you have food available to you in your local community, either within a walking distance or an easy drive, you will have better health outcomes. 58% of census tracts within High Point are designated as low income and low food access. This is USDA's way of saying they're food deserts. So half of census tracts in High Point are food deserts. 6,800 individuals within High Point get 1 serving or less of fruit and vegetables daily. When your supermarket or your grocery store is your Dollar General, you're not going to be getting good quality fresh fruits and vegetables. 31% of Black households in High Point receive SNAP or EBT benefits, otherwise known as food stamps, while 10% of white households receive this public benefit. The average cost of food for a median household in High Point in 2022 was nearly $9,000. That's 25% of the Black median household income. So if you're spending 30% or more on your rent and 25% on your food, you don't have a lot left over for your health care, your kids' education, abilities to save money and move up the economic ladder. Some of the recommendations that came out of the task force that was working on this were to improve access to quality prenatal care. That disparity in infant mortality must be tackled. We must think about how to get prenatal programs into the community. This is very much in line with the YWCA's mission and the work that they're doing in this community. We need to expand job opportunities and wage equality, but we have to think about that in terms of place and transportation and where people are living versus where jobs are being developed. How do we get to jobs if not for better transportation? We need to address systemic racism in the school. When we look at the disparities between expulsions, suspensions, and other forms of discipline, we see that Black children are much higher rates than white children. How do we create a school that's safe and nurturing and not punitive and damaging? How do we improve public transportation so that people can get to medical care, food, and other services? How do we enhance voter registration efforts as a means to civic participation? We have communities where the voting rates are extremely low. Taxation without representation was a key element of founding of the country. We need to have representation in every community in deciding how we spend our dollars and how we manage our community. Crime prevention and community engagement. How do we create a police force that is less surveillance and policing and more community building and prevention? How do we promote home ownership and fair lending in a way that enhances communities that had been redlined, that had been urban renewed, that had been stripped of property ownership? How do we create more affordable housing initiatives? And I have to say, as someone who studies housing within the Triad, I'm seeing lots of growth in this area in High Point with the work that's going on. But there's more that needs to be done. The gap between the amount of housing that's available and the amount of housing that's needed is huge. We need to improve access to quality health care. This isn't just having a hospital, it's having ways in which people can get to the clinics, having clinics that are in their communities, having clinics that are easily accessible to all. Working upstream in healthcare so that we prevent people from having to go to the hospital in the first place for asthma or diabetes or other preventable lifestyle diseases that are environmentally linked to where we live. Finally, how do we promote digital inclusion? The pandemic really taught us an important lesson. Kids who can't get online couldn't have schooling, couldn't have access to all the extra resources that were being promoted in the community. Individuals who couldn't get online with high-speed internet in their home couldn't work. They lost wages. We see people today moving around the country as a result of having access to high-speed internet. How do we build that access here within this community as well? Here's a list of the data sources. They're also printed in the scorecard and available in the online version as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time for that.
Thank you, Dr. Seals. Before we open it up for questions, I just want to make sure that I recognize Guilford County Sheriff Danny Rogers, who has joined us today in chambers as well. Thank you for that presentation. It's extremely eye-opening, and there's a lot of data points in, I think, that a lot of folks maybe don't think about how connectively things are happening and why the outcomes are the way they are. And so what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions from our committee.
So Dr. Seals, I'm curious, as far as the recommendations, some of them aren't related. Some of the city as a government can do. What are some sort of easier things that the city could implement that would address some of your recommendations?
Yeah, I think one of the easiest things to do is to, in a way, declare areas that had been redlined in the past or urban renewed in the past as concentration areas for efforts. And those efforts, as you point out, are not just of the city. They're efforts of the business community, they're efforts of the educational community, the policing community, and philanthropic community in the area. How do we wrap holistic approaches around communities that had been disinvested in? And that would focus on housing issues, transportation issues, food access issues, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Seals, you spoke earlier about historical policies, redlining, things of those natures. In terms of the prevalence and remaining remnants of those particular types of policies, what would you say, percentage-wise, that we're still dealing with some of those issues today, some of those policies, and how they're still pervasive in how some of these outcomes are persisting?
Yeah. So we see the persistence or stickiness of those policies every day. I can't put a percentage to it, but I would say that most of the inequities that we're seeing are related to that 120-year history of disenfranchisement. If we go back to the 1900 to 1920 time period when this city and other cities were engaged in racialized zoning and concentrating black populations in particular areas, we actually saw a boom in home ownership, in business starts, in development of thriving local mixed-use, mixed-income communities, the thing that we're trying to get back to in many ways. After about 1920, we saw racial covenants, we saw redlining while we didn't see homeowners loan corporation maps for High Point specifically, the practice was engaged in here. And we see that those same neighborhoods that had been concentrations of black individuals then became disconnected from economic mobility through those loans from the federal government and other sources, GI Bill, et cetera. Those same places today are the same places where we see the low life expectancy, the low educational attainment, the limited economic mobility kind of occurring. Raj Chetty did a great study looking at opportunity. His website is called the Opportunity Atlas. And if we look at the census tracts within High Point, we'll see those same redlined areas lack upward mobility over the life course or between generations. If you're born in poverty into one of these census tracts, you are not going to move up. Your likelihood of moving up into a higher tax bracket is very limited. How do we then address that? And I think that's back to Dr. Harmon's question. How do we address that as a government and philanthropy and business? We need to get access to capital back into those communities. We need to get home ownership back into those communities. We need to get thriving business districts back into those communities, resetting the balance that was disturbed 100 years ago.
Thank you. I think there was an interesting statistic on the access to capital when it comes to home ownership. if you could kind of touch on that again, you're saying that you said all things being equal, all things being equal, there's still a gap between access to capital for home ownership between black and white, even similarly, incomes, credit scores, everything, and there's still a pervasive gap.
Since 2006, I've been studying as a part of my academic pursuit FFEIC data or Housing Mortgage Loan Disclosure Act, HMDA data sets. And the data set's gotten actually better over the past few years. In this data set, you can look at any census tract, any city, any county, anywhere in the states, and see how many loan applications were submitted. Every bank, every lending institution is required to submit a loan application registry, even if a loan is not originated. So it gives us a great view of who applied but didn't get a loan. In that loan application registry, it collects demographics, it collects the economics of the family applying, because they need to see if they're worthy of that mortgage. It collects information about the home being applied for, the census tract that it's located in, et cetera. We use a method called logistic regression, which controls for setting everything equally, the income of the applicant, the price of the home, the type of neighborhood that it is, all of the other data points. And then we allow to float different, the race or the gender of the applicant. And so we see that there's a disproportionate approval rate, all else being equal, if you're a person of color than a white applicant. We do know when we look at it individually by lending institution, some lending institutions are quite fair. I've watched the data for Self-Help Credit Union as an example, Latino Credit Union, several others that really do a good job at almost equally dispensing mortgages, approving mortgages for residents that are equally qualified. But then we see other lending institutions. The Wells Fargos and the Banks of America have had their hands slapped more than once for disproportionate outcomes in places like Charlotte and other markets. Perhaps we could look very closely here at our market and see how can we bolster those lending institutions that have more equitable lending practices and improve the conditions.
I'm sorry, if anyone else has any questions, please jump in.
So I just make a comment that I've known Dr. Sills quite a few years, and one time after I met with him, I mentioned to my colleague, I want to do a game show. What does Stephen not know? Dr. Sills seems to know a lot. So if y'all need an expert on anything, Dr. Sills is your man.
Thank you. I know a little about a lot.
So I just want to dive in a little bit deeper because one of the things that one of the kind of like whip back responses that can happen to this is, are we taking property from current property owners and giving it to people who are not property owners? Short of doing that, which, you know, I would say there's a case for some people to make that argument, but short of doing that, what can the city government do within the North Carolina parameters to push this forward and to make this possible?
Yeah, so two layers there. We'll take the first part. The city of High Point actually helped push the state legislature for a mechanism to be able to take land that is not being used appropriately, that is condemnable, and individuals are not repairing. City of Greensboro next door built a pilot that never got to go anywhere because of the pandemic, but that pilot was going to move substandard properties with an order to repair and no repair being done to the hands of a nonprofit developer who could then repair that property, control the property for a period of time, usually 3 years, recoup their funds on that. The owner would then have the option to pay back all of the repairs and make the nonprofit whole, or the property would pass deed to the nonprofit, who could then either sell it to a low-income family, rent as an affordable rental, or other property. Other states use this mechanism very well to take properties that will never get used back into use. So it's a good land use tool. For example, you have a home that's falling in on itself. The best you can do as a city is in order to demolish, but then it just sits there, right? How do you get that property back into fair use in the market? We know that at any given time, there's 6 to 9% of units that are vacant or vacant and abandoned in this local market. How do we make those new affordable opportunities? How do we consolidate? City of Rocky Mount, we looked at how do we consolidate 2 or 3 of these parcels together and create a new housing development, townhouses or other opportunities. So that's one thing. We're not wanting to take anyone's property away from them. We're wanting to use disused properties in a better manner, good land use policy. The other is incentivizing individuals to buy in certain areas, and the City of High Point's been fairly successful with this. Back when we did the 2015 market segmentation study, we identified certain neighborhoods where we wanted home ownership to increase. If you have 10, 15% home ownership in a neighborhood, people aren't as invested in that neighborhood in keeping it up, being civically participatory in that neighborhood, maintaining their properties. The landlords, who often are not here locally, have no reason to keep it up as that hurts their bottom line. How do you get more homeowners in a neighborhood? You offer the incentives. You offer property at a discount. You use a community land trust. You use down payment assistance programs, which we have lots of access to and hopefully can get even further with the state legislative support to the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency. High Point, I think, has been very successful in that. Some of the other elements, though, the business. How do you get business communities back into neighborhoods? Well, that's rethinking our land use policy a little bit. Point at Minneapolis as an example. If we get rid of single-family zoning, and I don't want any NIMBYism to, single-family zoning excludes business opportunities within a neighborhood. A thriving neighborhood used to have a market and a deli and a restaurant and a diner and all of these things within walking distance to your home. Our new urbanism since the 1990s has designed communities around that principle because it works really well. How do we incentivize business starts within historically black neighborhoods where we're increasing home ownership, but also investing in things like the neighborhood grocery and a diner and a tutoring center and other for-profit mechanisms. These are ways to further build wealth or rebuild wealth within the black community. None of those involve taking property away. They involve using the land and the property that we have available and making it more productive. And there's a tax benefit to the city for that.
Absolutely. Dr. Seals, I had a question, something that kind of popped into my mind as we were thinking about the applications for capital. I know that there is often demographic data collected in some of these applications. Do you think that has hurt or helped? Do you think it's time to eliminate those demographic collection items, or?
I would highly disagree with eliminating that. That data shows us the disparities. Eliminating and creating colorblind, even further colorblind, would blind us to the inequalities that are happening there. Everything we do is a social process. Everything we do is a social interaction. I bought a house. It was a 1780s log cabin out in Pleasant Garden. It's the hardest thing in the world to get a comp for. How do you get a comp for a 1780s log cabin as a farm? I worked through the night back and forth with my mortgage broker. We were sending documents. We were talking through things. Probably went on for about a week there. And I mean, like at midnight, we were back and forth on this thing because he really wanted to help me get this deal done. That's a social process with that mortgage broker who's helping me out. We know that the mortgage industry is not just a submit a file and it's it does see who you are and your connections. Your networks and your social interactions matter in that process as much as any other process. How do we then create better safety nets, better connections, better networks? We have underbanked communities. We have neighborhoods where you can't go and get a mortgage. You have to drive across town to find a bank that might or might not service you. How do we get that bank in that neighborhood so that they know you on a daily basis when you come in to cash your check or check your account or draw money out? How do we get back to that kind of interaction?
So would you say that if we increase the prevalence of neighborhood banking, that it would put pressure on larger lending institutions?
Could, yeah.
To have better practices?
I think local banks, we have several examples historically here in the state. Mechanics and Farmers is a great example. Those local banks that serve their community and are of their community do a better job at more equitably distributing funds. I think, yeah, we need more of that. That could put some pressure on the large banking institutions, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Seals. Any further questions for Dr. Seals?
So, can't think of the term, but what Greensboro is trying to do with the new state law, it's not nuisance abatement, it's called something else. I can't think what it is now. Has anybody done what Greensboro tried to do but stopped because of the pandemic across the state, as an example?
I have not seen a version of it yet. Lots of talk in Wilmington and Asheville and others. I have not seen it applied, so there's not any kind of litigation. We know that there will be litigation once that process is ironed out. It has not been tested yet.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Moore, I just have appreciate all the information. I saw your presentation at the church back in December. And as I think we've all mentioned, the numbers bring up lots of questions. But you said early on in your presentation that the study didn't explore why. Can you explain why? Because for me, in my mindset, if we don't get to a why,
Yeah.
or if we can get to a why, then maybe we move more toward the desired end of what you're studying.
So the scorecard is not meant to explain why. It's meant to be the measure that you then track over time. The document that explains why is that Reparations Commission's report. It goes all the way back to the 1700s and brings us forward through the process of disenfranchisement that really explains and this is why we have these disparities today. It is the why, yeah.
And have you done a study of a different type, maybe where you study the successes that have occurred in the minority community and how we replicate that?
Yes, so best practice studies are fairly common and come into play when we look at recommendations in particular. How do we take something that's working in another similar community with a similar demographic and economic structure, similar policy or cultural framework, and how do we apply what's working there here? And yes, we've looked at many of those studies.
Thank you.
Certainly.
I just had one more question, because we haven't really, we touched on housing, which is huge, and this council is working really hard to work on that. But education is a piece that we don't specifically have any power control over. So where do you see that falling into our solutions when it comes to equitable education in High Point?
Yeah. I think that this body and the public in High Point have a lot of political power that can be exercised at the county level. I think we're at a very beneficial moment right now in Guilford County in that we're seeing alignment between the two city councils and governments and the county. And I believe the school district itself as well is thinking in the same direction. I think they need to hear your voices as well as the the population here in High Point very loudly championing education that has a racial lens and thinks in terms of policies that would benefit communities of color. I believe, again, that power of voice is an important tool that can be used.
Thank you. Councilmember Cook, I know that there are several initiatives at the county level, transportation and homelessness and housing. I think you're joining that. So Dr. Seals is absolutely correct. I think this is probably the most alignment on issues of this type that the county is seeing in a long time. So
I guess what I was kind of hoping was maybe to touch on the fact that most of our schools are Title I schools, which means the majority of our children are living in poverty in High Point that go to public schools.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that is the most important element, is to address those basic needs of shelter, food, water, and a sense of safety on a citywide level. And then that should help those other initiatives. But I think by placing all of that responsibility on the school system, we are washing our hands a little bit of our responsibility as a city to make sure that our children and their families and everyone here has access to those basic needs first.
Very much in agreement, and another area that the city can participate in especially is that pre-K and readiness. If you have kids in universal pre-K or at least targeted 3- and 4-year-old programs, they show up to school at 5 years old much more ready. Their third-year reading scores, their math scores are much more in line with the median than they are. So pre-K may be another opportunity there.
Dr. Seals, thank you again.
Can I jump in one more
Of course.
thing on education? I think also as we look at this, as I said, that it's big if you look at education, economics, and everything individually, but to touch on yours, I'm just going to share with you my memory as somebody that grew up in High Point City schools and was very much opposed to the combining into the Guilford County schools. We talk about getting banks and delis and things back into the communities where it's more local. We by over the years and that growth, in my opinion, we're asking our teachers and our police officers, which are both understaffed at this time for different reasons, we're asking them to do more things than we ever asked of those professions before, and expecting better results. So that has to come into the equation too, along with the fact that there's certain areas that have economic disadvantages, or they don't have the parental structure or whatever all goes into that. So I agree with the fact that we were better off when we had local community banks instead of the Wells Fargos of the world, which we've always had, but not to the degree we have now. So I think that's a good philosophy, but I did want to give a tip of the hat to Sheriff Rogers and any other police officers or teachers who may be, or former, that may be in here, that your role has become more than it was in my memory when I was growing up with my peers. So I think that has affected these numbers in the, Lord, I don't know if I want to say this, in the 45 years since I left school. So, anyway.
Thank you. Dr. Seals?
Are we allowed to kind of tie in?
I think in the interest of time, Sheriff Rogers, if you wanted to get Managing Director Hollis a question, we could maybe respond back to you, but we do have another item on our agenda that we have to cover. All right. Thank you, Dr. Seals. We appreciate the information, and it's very eye-opening.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Next item on our agenda is 2024-111, update regarding a proposal from Clark Powell for equipment upgrades for video capturing capabilities to stream meetings to various platforms. We will have Managing Director Jerron Hollis presenting.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This item is to really return council's consideration from the January 17th meeting to upfit council chambers with video capturing capabilities, stream meetings on platforms. The company, Clark Powell, that proposal should be attached in your documents. They've worked with staff for several years in the support and design of our current audio and broadcast equipment that's in the chamber right now that we're using. They provided a quote for upgrades that consist of additional point tilt zoom cameras in the chamber and installing a camera controller and support equipment that will do a couple of things: help with expanding Zoom and Microsoft Teams integration. There'll be also upgrades that are necessary for the switching controls that a live video meeting would require. There's also a section in the proposal at the discretion of council if there was a desire to get additional point tilt zoom cameras in the third floor conference room, the fishbowl. The quote has a Cablecast app. We talked about that before, and what that would essentially do is allow our community to, on any of a number of apps that they use for other streaming services, also stream the content that's on our television channel. And a Smart Hub converter, which would allow us to insert regularly scheduled programming in addition to council meetings, other programming that we would have on those platforms. The other piece that's important there, as was discussed in the January 17th meeting, is that the step to move forward with the video production meetings would, from staff, have a recommendation of an additional communication specialist, which we talked about before, that would be needed, as well as a revision to our current broadcast policy. So that particular item, as you see, has a budget impact of just under $165,000. And as you'll see in the agenda item, the total compensation that will be included for a staff member is at the $99,000 that would be annually. Be glad to take any questions, Mr. Chair, or from members of the committee at this point.
Do we have any questions from the committee at this time?
Can you visually point out where things would be, just so we can imagine it?
I've got our marketing manager here, Ryan. If I step on something, you can help me. But essentially, when you talk about a council meeting like we have here, it is still a public meeting. This would add an additional step because it would actually be a broadcast. So you think about anything that's on TV, you'd have a camera for a wide shot that would see the entire group. You'd have a mid-range camera, and you'd have a camera that will focus on this end for the lectern. So picture what we have now, the same meeting, but just giving access in the control room to be able to look at different aspects. So if Councilman Moore is speaking, or if Councilman Harmon is speaking, it would be able to have a function that goes from, who's calling the question, who's having comments. And you've seen it a million times in many other communities. So it would look like a meeting production that you would see in any city in the state.
And the placement in the room, there would be about 3.
Yes. This
Okay,
quote
so-
would have, in this room, would have 3 additional cameras, roughly to cover those aspects that I just discussed.
Have you gotten any other quotes from other firms? I'm assuming there are other firms that do this type of work.
Yeah, well, what we do with this kind of work, the Clark Powell, they actually bid under state contract. And I don't have Eric's here. He's the resident financial guru in the building. But so because they go through state contract, they've already negotiated the quote unquote best price. So there are other vendors, but when we go through state contract, that takes out that particular say bidding step. I'm probably chewing that up a little bit, Eric, but that's essentially when we go through state contract how we streamline the process.
Exactly how you said so.
There we go. Now I'm a resident financial expert.
Have there been any other, I'm all in favor of this, but there's, unintended consequences of having videos that sort of can change the dynamic a little bit. So have other councils had issues coming up when they start broadcasting with video, either from the general public or council folks? I know I got to get my hair done if I'm on TV.
Absolutely. Well, I think from a broadcast standpoint, I've been in local government, I'm like Councilman, I'm afraid to say, probably 20 years or more. And the consistent piece of a video council meeting, which, has been going on for years, is that you are real-time capturing the events that we see now, which, as a point, we're capturing by audio as we speak. Everything you're saying is captured on audio. So if someone wants to hear what was said in that tech committee meeting, they can go click a link and they can hear it. I would say some that would say if you add that video component, it does add more visibility to what's being said. You're seeing facial expressions. You're seeing what's happening real time. So from an engagement standpoint, just a purely philosophical engagement standpoint, it puts you there in the meeting. Now, practical pieces, and I would defer to Madam Clerk on this, if people want to know what was said or what was done in a meeting, a video meeting allows you in a more intuitive way than even an audio broadcast to see what's happening, and it gives that access of the resident to be able to sort of on demand see and hear what's happening even if they weren't there. The piece about this particular technology that we didn't have years ago is downloading apps. So now the way we're currently set up, if I am a cable customer as part of the PEG agreement through the state, then they provide a channel access for us. But if I'm not a cable customer, and we know now people get their entertainment in a number of ways on Amazon or Hulu or whatever, this opens up to more people being able to access that information by just downloading a City of High Point app. We provide the baseline stream, and it goes out to these apps through that mechanism. So that's a technological capability that we didn't have years ago that really expands access. So this is all tied into that with a 2024 lens.
Jerron, that would be a free app, right? There would be no cost to citizens to download that app to access it.
If they have the High Point TV app would be our app. Now, if they're currently a customer with, Hulu or some of the other places, that would be, they wouldn't be any change to what they already have. But our app would be a free app.
But specifically, if they wanted to access any streaming from the City of High Point, it would be
Free.
It would be the download for the city app, and then it would all be free to access.
That's right. I'll let Ryan get into some of the nuts and bolts.
So what he's talking about, things like Hulu, those are things that you would download on Fire TV, like a Fire Stick, an Amazon Fire Stick. So that's where that would come into play. So the same thing is where Hulu is an app that you can download through there. We would have an application that you'd be able to download on that.
Okay.
So there would be no cost to that. There's no subscription service or things like that. I believe Guilford County Schools, I believe, has their own applications. You can download something like that. That was some of the examples that we've had. So no, there'd be no cost for that, just to download that. But we could do that through Fire TV, through Roku, through Apple TV, things of that nature.
Chairman Holmes, and if I could just add one more thing to
Sure.
Dr. Harmon's question about unintended consequences. One thing to note is that there could be unintended consequences as far as people through public comment wanting to come and certainly be able to kind of have their time on video. There's a trend across the country for full transparency of people using public comment period for viral moments. That's something that comes up a lot. And then we have to consider what our policy is for entertaining those and allowing those to go on. Currently for our public comment, we have a 3-minute time period, but there certainly are some unintended consequences as far as perhaps people in the community that would want to kind of use it for, not the purpose that it was intended for, just to have their moment of their First Amendment right to say anything they want, which may or may not be relevant or appropriate. And that's just something that we've seen and talked about across the country from a city attorney's perspective of kind of what the policy is and what we allow and what is then broadcast and can go viral. So just for full transparency, I just didn't want to add that about unintended consequences.
And part of that platform too, and thank you, Madam Attorney. Part of that platform, we would have capability to sort of hit a mute button, kill switch, those kinds of things that would help with the broadcast, whether there's delay.
It would depend on what our policy was.
Yeah, right.
Well-
What we wanted to allow.
The technology we would have the capability through the technology. But to Madam Attorney's
Right.
point, we would have to develop a policy that council would say, okay, 3 minutes, if you go over 3 minutes, then this is what happens. So I'm talking about the technology piece. Now, the implementation of what the council decides, how long we would allow someone to speak after 3 minutes, which honestly we've seen without video, but there are some challenges there. It could also, if you have more people that want to participate, it could also make the meetings a little longer.
Sure.
So those are things, practical applications that cities across the state are having to, have had to deal with over the years.
So prior to any implementation, we would have to look at our policy, current policy on public address and craft one that would fit with the implementation in technology.
Yeah. Yes, sir, because that could dictate some minor tweaks or changes
Sure.
to actually what we install and how we install it. Nothing major, but it would be really incumbent on the council, should they choose to do that, to kind of set the parameters of what the expectations are of that production, of that broadcast production.
Certainly. Any other questions?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment really quickly that one of the pieces of this engagement is we do understand that there's going to be some, trial and error, and we're going to learn as a community how to implement this. But our intention in creating even this committee was to make sure that the public was feeling welcome and engaged. And for me personally, I think having a visual image of what the room even looks like is the first step towards somebody coming and participating in our local government. And we have no expectation that anybody that comes to give public comment or here for any other reason has experience and knows the right and wrong ways to behave. We are here for all people to come, and I think recently we've had some commentary from people who said, I was so nervous, I don't speak as well as other people do, but they got follow-up on their concern, and to them, that was the meaningful aspect. So I don't want to make it seem like we're also going to set the parameters so strict that someone would need to feel afraid to come here. I think that this is an opportunity, in my mind, for people to have a view in and then to see themselves in these seats. This is amazing for a committee meeting to see this many people in seats. I'm really excited about that.
Jerron, could you give us some comparisons to other municipalities who have done this? Where is High Point in terms of us being current with technology?
We have, in recent years, really brought on by COVID. We started about, was that 20? Where we started audio broadcasting the meetings and streaming that. Prior to that, we hadn't done anything as far as streaming. And one of the things that we saw with that was it was a different level of preparation and also a different level of engagement with the community. Most communities in the state, large, small, have over the years are doing some level of video broadcasting. In fact, through the public and education dollars that come from the state, they really encourage cities to use those channels for that purpose of putting information out. So we were probably one of the last major cities not to video meetings, just in answer to your question about where we stand. But technology, as a city, we do really well with technology. I mean, we have a lot of, we lead the way in some things in technology. We have just chosen over the years not to video meetings, and this represents a change in what we've done in the past, what is in this proposal.
Great. So if we wanted to move forward, what are the next steps?
Well, this is an information item for the committee. If the council wanted to take further action, there would need to be a recommendation of some sort to move this to finance and then it would be considered as we would any other proposal of contract or services.
Any,
I think the policy side probably would need to be discussed before moving it forward. I don't know what other people think.
How long will that take? Policy discussion. I mean,
Madam
just considering we're entering budget season and all that sort of stuff.
Do we have
We only have one meeting in April.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, we need a policy as to how it's going to be
We
implemented.
have a policy for public comment, and I think we currently have a broadcast one, is that right?
We have a policy that determines on some level what we're doing now, but it doesn't incorporate some of the pieces that we would talk about with video. So we'd have to look in.
Update those. Probably review and update
Yeah, yeah.
those.
So, and I think the item is just to update what we have. So we currently have somewhat of a policy, but it was not created with broadcasting a video meeting in mind, so it would need to be tweaked.
so if we were to get a draft update of what a policy would look like, we could then potentially move this forward, if everyone's in agreement on looking at the policy first, prior to sending this to finance.
And there's a gap, I mean, because the next finance committee is next week or whatever, but then there's a big gap,
Yeah.
right? Because April,
Yeah.
and so this full council wouldn't take it up till like May anyway, right? So, I guess what I'm suggesting as we go, I would make a recommendation, we make a recommendation today, in the interim. Look
Is
at
that-
policies, because that'll be done by the time we can
So
actually
you want
approve it
to-
as a council.
You're wanting to direct Jerron and the staff to look at updating the policy with audio in it. Is that what you're saying?
Video.
I meant
Yeah.
video.
And that's for
Saying
us to
concurrent.
approve or for the full council to approve?
Well, council has to approve the policy.
Yeah, full council has to approve the policy. We have to make a recommendation that it go to council.
Okay.
If I may, a couple of things to think about is the direction for the finance committee is for the budget amendment.
Sure.
If that needs to happen before, but the other option is to have that happen with the annual budget that would be approved in July. That part of what maybe Mr. Hollis can speak about is what the implementation time is to have the equipment installed and how long that would take. So that may be a driver of the decision as well.
Yeah. So once this is put in place, I think the timetable that we've had from the vendor is we're looking at, if I recall correctly, and that was a 90, 120-day window from them saying move forward to, order materials and getting everything set up. And I'll have Ryan.
Sorry, it's Ryan Ferguson. So depending on scheduling of the company, depending on supply chains, this type of equipment, the chips, the cameras, and all those kinds of things still does have a little bit further. It's way better than what it was, but it does have timelines kind of extended a little bit more to kind of get that equipment. Much better place than we were a couple of years ago or even 1 year ago. But I would assume that it's the 90 to 120 days to kind of get in here, get on the schedule, get in here, get that equipment ordered and in and ready to rock and roll. We do have some of the good thing is we do have some of the infrastructure in place, the wiring. We went ahead and while we did what we did here with microphones and some of these TVs, we prepped for this down the road just to kind of make sure that we were ready for it. So some of it has already been taken care of within the existing infrastructure that will allow us to do this a little bit quicker.
But is it possible to go ahead and push for the budget item to order so we can have the items here before they're ready to flip on and we'll have the policy in place in that 90 to 120-day window? Or do we have to have everything passed?
Madam Attorney, could this be concurrent? Could we ask for policy review and also make a recommendation to send this item to finance in the form of a single motion?
Then I move to push the policy review to the staff and to make a recommendation to finance to approve the bid for the equipment to be installed, to order and install.
And the position.
And the position.
and the position of the communications specialist to do this.
All right. There's a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
A second.
There's a motion and a second. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Are there anything else to come before the Tech Committee today? If not, no, unfortunately, Ally, we not public comments. But we appreciate your enthusiasm. But if there's nothing else to come before the Tech Committee today, then we are